That setup from Brian Enton is doing more work than it might appear to be doing on the surface. He is not just saying John Ramsey has an interesting perspective. He is saying something more specific. He is saying that there are almost no other cases in modern American history that reach this level of national visibility, this level of media saturation, this level of institutional scrutiny, and that the JonBenét's Ramsey case is one of the few that did. And the person who was inside that case, not as an investigator or a journalist, but as a family member, is John Ramsey. That is a very specific kind of authority. It is not the authority of someone who has studied cases like this from the outside. It is the authority of someone who has been processed by the system, who has sat in rooms with police who believed he was guilty, who has watched his family's grief become a media product, who has had to navigate an investigation while simultaneously grieving a child, defending himself against public accusation, and trying to understand what the institution that was supposed to find his daughter's killer was actually doing. And 30 years later, he is willing to sit down with a reporter and say, "Here's what I learned. Here's what I see in the Nancy Guthrie case. Here's what the Guthrie family needs to do. And here's what the police are not going to want to hear." That is a remarkable thing to offer publicly. And the fact that most coverage of this interview focused on the headline, scrutinized the police, and moved on without spending time in the actual substance of what Ramsey said, is one of the things this video exists to correct, because the substance is extraordinary. And it starts with a single word that Ramsey uses early in the conversation, a word that has also appeared in the Reuters investigation into the Guthrie case, in the reporting about the FBI director's public criticism of the Pima County Sheriff, and in the statement from a sergeant inside the sheriff's own department who went on record about the investigation's handling. The word is territorialism. And John Ramsey does not use it lightly. He uses it because he watched it destroy the investigation into his own daughter's murder, and because he believes, based on everything that has been publicly reported about the Nancy Guthrie case, that he is watching a version of the same thing happen again, in real time, 30 years later. To understand why that word matters so much, you have to understand the structure of American law enforcement. Not as a concept, but as a lived reality that shapes what happens, and what fails to happen, in serious crime investigations across this country every single day. There are 18,000 separate law enforcement jurisdictions in the United States. 18,000. Each one is its own independent entity. Each one has its own chain of command, its own budget, its own culture, its own definition of what good police work looks like, and its own absolute authority over what happens within its geographic boundaries. The smallest jurisdiction John Ramsey is aware of is a town of 650 people in Ohio that has a part-time police chief and a part-time detective. That is the entire law enforcement apparatus for that town. And if a serious crime occurs there, those two part-time employees are in charge, completely and legally in charge. And if they choose not to ask for help, they do not have to. That is not a theoretical scenario. That is the system. That is how it works. And here's the thing about that system that gets obscured in the day-to-day coverage of crime cases. The problem is not just small departments. The problem is the culture. The culture that says, regardless of the size of the department, this is our jurisdiction, this is our case, and we handle it ourselves. The culture that treats a request for outside help not as a sign of good judgment, but as an admission of weakness. The culture that John Ramsey calls, with the precision of a man who has spent 30 years watching its consequences, the Barney Fife syndrome. Barney Fife, for anyone who needs the reference, was the deputy sheriff in the classic American television show. He was not a villain. He was not incompetent in every sense of the word. He was a man whose belief in his own law enforcement capability was dramatically larger than his actual capability. He was so convinced he was equipped to handle whatever came through Mayberry that the town's actual sheriff had to take the bullets out of his gun to stop him from accidentally shooting someone while trying to prove he had everything under control. John Ramsey is not using that reference to be funny. He is using it because it is the most accurate cultural shorthand he has found for a specific institutional failure that costs real lives in real cases across America, and that he believes is costing Nancy Guthrie and her family right now.
Not sure what's accurate, but it appears there was a level of territorialism involved, and that's a huge problem in our country, in my opinion, the way we're structured. And that was a big problem in our case. The police didn't seek help from people that knew what they're doing. And help was offered. But we have 18,000 police jurisdictions in this country. The smallest one I'm aware of is a little town of 650 people in Ohio. has a part-time police chief and a part-time detective. That's the police department, but they're in charge. And there was a murder in that little town, and the police wouldn't ask for help.
Serious crimes. We need to respond with maximum force and resources, and I'm not sure that happened in that case. That is John Ramsey. And the reason that sentence carries the weight it does is not because it is a dramatic claim. It is because it is a specific, direct, measured assessment from someone who knows exactly what maximum force and resources looks like in a serious case, and who has also seen from the inside what the absence of it produces. In Boulder in 1996, the investigators assigned to the JonBenét's Ramsey case were not homicide detectives. Boulder did not have homicide detectives. The two investigators who handled the case for years were, as Ramsey describes it, an auto theft investigator and a narcotics officer. Men who knew their assigned areas of expertise, but who had no experience with the specific forensic, behavioral, and investigative demands of a premeditated murder case. Not because someone made a catastrophically wrong decision in the assignment, but because the system placed them there by default. In the absence of someone more qualified, you use who you have. And the ego of the institution prevents you from going outside that roster to find someone who actually knows what they are doing. The Denver police offered 3 experienced homicide detectives. They were refused. Help was available. Multiple agencies offered it. All of it was refused. And for years, 2 men without the experience the case required held the investigation and pointed it, based on a strategy the DA himself later admitted was not grounded in evidence, directly at the family. Now, here's where the parallel to the Nancy Guthrie case becomes impossible to avoid. Reuters reported in February 2026 that the FBI had been blocked from accessing key evidence in the Guthrie case during the most critical early days of the investigation. The FBI director, Kash Patel, went on record publicly and said the FBI had been kept out of the case for several days early on. A sergeant inside the Pima County Sheriff's Department, not a rival agency, not a political opponent, but someone inside the same organization as the sheriff himself, went on record questioning how the investigation was being handled. Local community leaders in Pima County organized around the idea of removing Sheriff Nanos from leading the case entirely. And by the 100-day mark, the case had produced no public arrest, no named suspect, and a series of press conference updates from the sheriff that said, in their most reassuring version, "We are getting closer." John Ramsey heard all of that. He read those reports. And his response is not shock, it is recognition. He has seen this before. Not just in history books, in his own living room, in his own grief, in the specific, documented, later admitted failure of a law enforcement institution that chose the comfort of its own authority over the requirements of the case it was supposed to be solving. And the first place that failure showed up, in JonBenét's case, and based on Ramsey's reading of the public record, in the Nancy Guthrie case too, was at the crime scene itself. The crime scene is the foundation of every serious investigation. It is where the physical truth of what happened is preserved, documented, and collected before time, weather, and human activity begin erasing it. In a premeditated abduction, the crime scene is not just a location. It is a record, a biological and forensic record of who was there, what they touched, where they moved, and what they left behind, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. In the JonBenét's Ramsey case, the forensic team spent 2 hours at the scene before declaring they were done. 2 hours. The district attorney had to physically order them back in. And John Ramsey was later told by people who handle serious crime scene forensics professionally that the standard, the actual professional standard, is a minimum of 3 days on site. Not 2 hours, not 1 day, 3 days minimum, with specialized personnel, systematic collection, and a specific understanding that serious cases leave evidence in unexpected places that a rush team will not find. John Ramsey believes, based on what was publicly reported, that the Guthrie crime scene received approximately 1 day before investigators released it. And when the FBI arrived and said, "Not so fast, you are not done," the sheriff's office did not welcome the assist. The sheriff's office, according to the public record, pushed back. back. Now think about what releasing a crime scene too early actually means in forensic terms. The front porch of Nancy Guthrie's home was where blood was found. Blood that was confirmed to be hers, and that forensic analysis suggested was consistent with an assault and forced removal rather than a voluntary departure. That porch is a contact zone. It is a location where a masked, gloved suspect who had been surveilling the property for weeks based on the investigative timeline made physical contact with an 84-year-old woman and removed her from her home. In that contact zone, in the specific few square feet of a front porch on a February morning in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, there was potential biological evidence that extended beyond the visible blood pool. Trace DNA deposits on surfaces the suspect touched while managing the doorbell camera. Fiber transfers from clothing that left microscopic threads on the doorframe. Shoe impression evidence on the porch surface. Contact DNA on the doorbell camera housing itself, the device the suspect reached for and apparently tampered with around 1:47 a.m. Every one of those evidence categories requires time, expertise, and systematic collection to capture. Every one of them starts degrading the moment the scene is released to public access. And every one of them, potentially, belonged to the masked man in the backpack who walked up to that door in the dark of a February morning and took an 84-year-old grandmother out of her home. If one day was the extent of the forensic engagement with that scene, if the FBI's intervention, described in public reporting as urgent and contested, did not come early enough or was not given full access to what the scene contained, then the single most important physical location in this entire case may have been processed at a fraction of its evidentiary potential. That is not a small thing. In a case where the suspect has not been publicly identified, where the DNA from the glove produced no CODIS match, and where the investigation has publicly stalled, the possibility that the crime scene was processed inadequately is not a theoretical concern. It is a potential explanation for why a case with this much visible evidence has not produced a public resolution. And John Ramsey, watching from the outside with 30 years of experience watching exactly this failure pattern, is not surprised. He is heartsick, but he is not surprised. Because here is what was happening simultaneously, on the other side of the evidence access battle, that makes the crime scene processing issue even more significant. While the Pima County Sheriff's Department was managing the scene in the way it managed it, and while the FBI was reportedly being restricted from full access during the early critical days, investigators were also dealing with a suspect who, based on everything the public evidence shows, had not left the scene carelessly. The masked suspect on the doorbell camera was wearing gloves. He was wearing a mask. He was carrying a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker backpack. And he appears, based on the camera disconnecting at 1:47 a.m. and the reporting about what the footage showed, to have been actively interfering with the surveillance system rather than simply walking past it. That is not the behavior of a panicked opportunist. That is someone who understood that cameras existed, understood where the camera was, and took action against it. Someone who, as a former FBI profiler noted in coverage of the case, showed forensic awareness even if that awareness was not at the level of a professional criminal. Not a mastermind, not a ghost, but someone thinking about what could be traced back to them, which means the physical evidence that person left behind, the evidence that a properly resourced, properly timed, properly conducted forensic engagement with that crime scene might have captured, was the product of someone who was trying not to leave anything. And in that context, the difference between 2 hours and 3 days of forensic work, between 1 day and the FBI's more thorough approach, between a restricted access investigation and a fully resourced one, is not marginal. It is potentially the entire case. A person who takes precautions leaves less obvious evidence, but they still leave evidence. They leave it in the places they did not think to cover, the surface they touched while focused on something else, the fiber that transferred during the physical contact they could not fully control, the trace deposit on the camera housing that required a specific swabbing protocol that a rushed team in a 2-hour or 1-day engagement simply did not have time to reach. That evidence, if it existed, if it was collectible, is gone now. You cannot go back to a released crime scene and find what a properly resourced team would have found in the first 72 hours. The window closes, the evidence degrades, the opportunity passes. And now, past the 100-day mark, investigators are working with what they collected in that constrained early window. The glove, the blood, the footage, the DNA profile that did not match anyone in CODIS. Which brings us to the single most important technical moment in John Ramsey's entire conversation with Brian Enton. The moment that most most media coverage summarized in a single sentence and moved on from, but that, if you sit with it, changes the entire way you understand where this case currently stands and what could still happen. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, established in 1994, operational nationally by 1998. For nearly 3 decades, the most powerful DNA identification tool available to American law enforcement. A national database of DNA profiles from convicted criminals and arrestees, searchable by investigators who have an unknown DNA profile from a crime scene. You upload the unknown profile. You search the database. If the suspect has a prior arrest or conviction that resulted in DNA collection, their profile is in the system. And if it matches your unknown profile, you have a name. That is the tool. That is how it works. And it has worked extraordinarily well. Tens of thousands of cases resolved. Cold cases broken open. Violent offenders identified years or decades after the crime. Because it is a powerful tool used correctly within its specific limitations. Here is the limitation. CODIS only contains DNA profiles from people who have previously been processed by the criminal justice system in a way that required DNA collection. If the person who took Nancy Guthrie has never been arrested, never been convicted, never had their DNA collected as part of a legal process, their profile is not in CODIS. A search will return nothing. Not because the DNA is useless, not because the science failed, but because the tool was never designed to identify people who have not previously interacted with the criminal justice system in the required way. The unknown male DNA from the glove found roughly 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home produced no CODIS match. That was reported publicly, and a large portion of the audience following this case heard that update and interpreted it as the DNA led nowhere. The science came up empty. The forensic path is closed. John Ramsey wants you to understand that interpretation is wrong. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. And the reason he is in a position to tell you that is not just because he has been following developments in forensic science for 30 years. It is because the tool that makes it wrong, investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, is the same tool he has been pushing Boulder authorities to use on JonBenét's case. And it is the same tool that in 2018 ended a 40-year hunt for one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. 12 murders, 50 rapes, active from the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s. His DNA was at crime scenes, but it was not in CODIS. For decades, his profile sat in evidence files, producing no match, no lead, no identity, because he had never been arrested in a way that required DNA collection. In 2018, investigators uploaded his unknown DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy platform used by millions of people who have taken consumer ancestry tests. They found distant relatives in the database. They built a family tree. They used publicly available genealogical records, birth records, census data, and the biological relationships established through the consumer DNA matches to narrow the family tree down to a small number of candidates. They surveilled those candidates. They collected a discarded DNA sample from DeAngelo, something he threw away in public, a coffee cup or similar item, confirmed the match, and arrested him. He was 72 years old. He had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. And he was identified not because his DNA was in a criminal database, but because a distant relative had uploaded their DNA to an ancestry platform out of curiosity about their family history. That is IgG. That is what it can do. And John Ramsey is not speaking metaphorically when he calls it a nuclear weapon for crime solving. He is describing a technology that fundamentally changes the ceiling on what DNA evidence can achieve, not just in cold cases, but in active investigations where the unknown profile is fresh, viable, and already in investigators' hands. The unknown male DNA profile from the glove in the Nancy Guthrie case is fresh. It is viable. It is, based on everything in the public record, the single strongest forensic lead in the entire investigation. And the question that John Ramsey is asking, the question that this video is asking, is whether that profile is being processed through IgG, or whether investigators accepted the CODIS result as the end of the DNA story and moved on. Because if they accepted it as the end, they did not hit a wall. They stopped before they reached the door. And this is where the conversation between Enton and Ramsey reaches its most direct and most important moment. Savannah Guthrie has made public appeals that were extraordinary in their directness and their desperation. She appealed to the suspect directly. She appealed to anyone who might have information. She announced the $1 million reward with her siblings at her side, her voice breaking in ways that no professional broadcaster can or should control. She told the public that her mother needed medication, that every day mattered, that time was not abstract, it was her mother's life. And Savannah has also, notably, been relatively careful about the institutional conflict. She has not publicly criticized the sheriff the way the FBI director did. She has not added her public voice to the removal campaign. She has stayed in a lane that is emotionally transparent but institutionally cautious. That caution is almost certainly strategic. A family fighting for the return of a missing person cannot afford to alienate the primary investigative agency, regardless of their private feelings about that agency's performance. You cannot publicly torch the sheriff's bridge while the sheriff still holds the evidence. But the reporting from USA Today in May said something that added a layer of tension even to the family's careful public positioning. It reported that Sheriff Nanos had acknowledged he was not regularly communicating with the Guthrie family about the investigation's status, that the family had expressed frustration about the communication gap, that there was a distance between the investigative updates the family was receiving and the information they needed to understand what was actually happening. A sheriff who is not talking to the family of the victim in an active missing persons case. That detail, small as it sounds in a paragraph of institutional conflict, is the most human statement of what the institutional friction costs. The people paying the price for the fight between agencies are not the agencies. They are a daughter who gets on television every few weeks and asks the world to help find her mother. They are siblings who have given up parts of their own lives to manage a public campaign for information. They are grandchildren who have had to understand, in the way children understand things that adults struggle to explain, that their grandmother is somewhere, and that the adults who are supposed to bring her home are arguing with each other. That is the human cost of what looks from the outside like a bureaucratic turf war. Now let's talk about what the investigation actually looked like from inside the evidence, separate from the institutional conflict. Because the conflict does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of specific investigative decisions that either advanced or impeded the case. The decision-making around the surveillance footage request is one of the most revealing. Investigators eventually asked neighbors for security footage covering two specific windows, January 11th and January 31st. Both dates were weeks or days before the abduction. Both suggested the suspect had visited or surveilled the area before February 1st. The question that has never been fully answered publicly is when investigators identified those dates as significant. If they knew in the first 48 hours that the suspect had likely been surveilling the property for weeks, then the footage request should have gone out on February 2nd or 3rd, while the neighborhood cameras were most likely to still have usable data stored on their systems. Most consumer security cameras, Ring, Nest, Arlo, maintain local or cloud storage for somewhere between 30 and 90 days, depending on the subscription and the device settings. But storage gets overwritten. Cloud subscriptions lapse. Devices get reset. Every day that passes between the crime and the footage request is a day when potentially critical surveillance data from a neighbor's camera might be deleted, overwritten, or otherwise lost. The public record shows investigators were asking neighbors for footage from January 11th as late as February 12th, 11 days after the abduction. Whether that request went out earlier in private, before the public reporting about it, is not clear. But the 11-day gap between the crime and the first public evidence of an organized neighborhood footage campaign is another window that, if the institutional conflict delayed the coordination needed to execute it, carries a direct investigative cost. Former FBI agent Jason Pack said the pre-abduction visit evidence, when it became available, quote, could indicate that the person was there surveilling the place before the abduction happened. He said this strongly. He did not say possibly. He said could indicate, which is careful professional language for something he believed was almost certainly true. If that belief existed early in the investigation, and it almost certainly did, given that the investigative mind goes to surveillance timelines as a standard analytical step in kidnapping cases, then the question of when that belief translated into an organized, systematic footage request becomes critical. And the answer to that question is tangled in the same institutional conflict that delayed FBI evidence access, generated the director's public criticism, and put a sergeant inside the department in a position where they felt the need to go on record about the investigation's handling. Every one of these threads connects back to the same central problem. In a case with this much evidence, this much attention, and this much resource availability, the institutional friction between the agencies responsible for solving it may have created gaps that no individual evidence failure could fully explain. Now let's talk about what the sheriff actually did right. Because the honest version of this story is not a simple indictment. It is a complex picture that includes both legitimate investigative work and genuine institutional failures, and treating it as one-sided misses the truth. Sheriff Nanos made several decisions that reflected serious investigative thinking. He was early and clear in saying the case was targeted, not random, a statement that reflected genuine analytical confidence and was later backed up by nearly every expert who examined the behavioral evidence. He said from day one that investigators believed they understood the motive, and he held that line consistently, even under intense public pressure to reveal more than his tactical judgment allowed. He also repeatedly resisted the kind of public speculation that can contaminate an investigation. When social media was building theories about family involvement, he stated clearly and on record that every family member had been ruled out and should be understood as victims. That was a responsible statement that prioritized investigative accuracy over audience engagement. And he has consistently maintained that the investigation is active, moving forward, and approaching a resolution, even when the evidence of that progress was not visible to the public. Those are not the behaviors of a corrupt official or a negligent investigator. They are the behaviors of someone who is genuinely trying to work a complex case while managing an extraordinary level of public pressure and an interagency relationship that has clearly been strained. The problem is not that the sheriff is a bad person or an incompetent investigator. The problem is structural, and structural problems are, in some ways, harder to fix than personal ones. A personal failure can be corrected by a conversation, a reassignment, a change in approach. A structural problem, a fundamental clash between jurisdictional authority, institutional culture, and the specific demands of a nationally visible case, requires something more deliberate and more difficult. And that is what appears to have been absent in this case, at least in its early weeks. A deliberate, structured coordination framework that put the FBI's forensic and behavioral capabilities in direct service of the local investigation without creating the territorial conflict that eventually went public. The Boston Globe report from May 5th said the FBI director believed those early days, the days when the FBI was allegedly blocked from full access, were the most critical for the investigation. That is the standard view in kidnapping cases. The first 48 hours, sometimes extended to the first week, are when the physical trail is freshest, when the suspect is most likely to make a traceable error, when the behavioral pattern of the abduction can be most clearly reconstructed. If those days were compromised by institutional friction, the cost is not recoverable. You cannot go back to February 2nd and process the scene with the full FBI forensic team if you spent that day negotiating evidence access with a county sheriff's office. Those hours are gone. Whatever they contain, whatever lead they might have generated, whatever detail they might have captured before it faded or was lost, is now part of a counterfactual history that nobody can access. That is the real cost of what the director is describing, not the political embarrassment of a public fight, not the institutional damage of an interagency conflict. The real cost is measured in hours, in evidence, in the difference between a case that resolves in 2 weeks and a case that reaches 100 days without a public arrest. And that cost is being borne not by the agencies. It is being borne by Nancy Guthrie, wherever she is, and by her family in every waking hour since February 1st. Now let's talk about the sabotage question directly, because that word, sabotage, is in the title of this video, and it deserves a direct and honest answer. Is the case being sabotaged from the inside? The word sabotage implies intention. It implies that someone, or some institutional actor, is deliberately impeding the investigation for reasons other than legitimate investigative strategy. It is a strong word, and it requires strong evidence before it can be applied responsibly. What the public record shows is this: evidence access was restricted or delayed, according to Reuters and the FBI director's own public statement. A sergeant within the department raised internal concerns about the investigation's handling. Local community leaders organized around the idea of removing the sheriff from the case. The FBI director publicly criticized the sheriff in terms that went beyond routine interagency frustration. What the public record does not show is any evidence of deliberate, intentional obstruction by any specific individual. No one has been charged with evidence tampering. No one has been removed from the case for cause. No official body has made a finding that the investigation was improperly conducted. The honest answer to the sabotage question, therefore, is this: there is substantial public evidence of institutional dysfunction in this investigation. There is documented conflict between the primary investigating agency and the federal partner that should have been most helpful in resolving the case. There is internal dissent within the sheriff's department that went public, and there is the FBI director on record saying the investigation was hampered by restricted access to evidence. Whether that dysfunction rises to the level of sabotage depends on your definition of the word. If sabotage requires intentional malice, the public evidence does not establish it. If sabotage can mean institutional ego, territorial protectiveness, and bureaucratic friction that produces the same practical result as intentional obstruction, then the question is far less comfortable to dismiss, because the effect on the case is the same either way. A coordination failure that delays evidence processing by a week produces the same lost leads as an intentional obstruction that delays it by a week. Nancy Guthrie's family does not benefit from the distinction between it was intentional and it was incompetent coordination. Either way, those hours are gone. And that is why the sabotage framing resonates, even if the strongest version of it cannot be fully supported by public evidence. Because the practical effect of what happened, a delayed, contested, publicly fractured investigation into the disappearance of an 84-year-old grandmother, looks, from the outside, like something went very wrong inside the system that was supposed to protect her. Now here's a dimension of this story that has been almost entirely overlooked in the coverage of the institutional conflict. The conflict between the FBI and the sheriff became public news. But there is a second layer of institutional dysfunction in this case that has received far less attention: the relationship between the investigation and the public tip process. Over 40,000 tips were submitted in this case. 40,000. That is an extraordinary number. It reflects the scale of public engagement, the celebrity adjacency of the case, and the genuinely viral nature of the story. But 40,000 tips is also 40,000 potential false leads, duplicate reports, copycat communications, hoaxes, and well-meaning but uninformed guesses that have to be processed by the same investigative team handling the actual evidence. The management of a tip volume of that scale in an active investigation requires a specific kind of organizational infrastructure: a dedicated tip processing team, a triage system that separates actionable information from noise, and a feedback mechanism that routes credible tips to the appropriate investigative unit without overloading the primary investigators. If that infrastructure was not fully in place, or if the institutional conflict between agencies disrupted its coordination, then the 40,000 tips become a potential liability rather than an asset. They create work. They create the appearance of progress, and they can actually absorb investigative resources that would be better deployed on the physical evidence. The ransom notes, specifically, represent the most dangerous version of this problem. Multiple fraudulent communications were submitted. At least one person was federally charged for submitting fraudulent ransom materials, and the FBI indicated that the original notes, potentially real according to their own assessment, were buried inside a wave of copycats that had to be individually assessed. How do you find the real signal in 40,000 pieces of noise when the noise includes fraudulent ransom demands, copycat threats, opportunistic money grabs, and genuine but uninformed public theories? The answer is investigative triage at a scale that requires exactly the kind of federal resource coordination that the institutional conflict may have complicated. And the person responsible for that triage in the structure of this investigation is the sheriff's office, working alongside or in friction with the FBI. Former FBI agent Harry Trombitas put it directly in his public commentary on the case. He said, "Cases with this level of public visibility generate a volume of tips that can paradoxically slow an investigation by creating false positives that consume investigative time." He said the key discipline in a high-visibility case is the ability to separate the structural evidence, the physical, forensic, behavioral facts, from the public noise, and to keep the investigation anchored to the evidence rather than chasing the loudest theories. Whether the Nancy Guthrie investigation maintained that discipline in the context of an institutional conflict that went public at the 100-day mark is a question the public record cannot fully answer. But the question itself, did the noise win over the signal for critical periods of this investigation, is one that deserves to be asked. Now let's bring this back to the larger question that the institutional conflict raises about American law enforcement. The Nancy Guthrie case is not unique in experiencing friction between local and federal agencies. That friction is a structural feature of American law enforcement, which is organized around 18,000 separate agencies operating under different jurisdictions, cultures, and accountability structures. The FBI brings resources, technology, and behavioral science that local agencies often cannot replicate. Local agencies bring geographic knowledge, community relationships, and jurisdictional authority that the FBI cannot simply assume. In the best cases, those complementary strengths align into an effective partnership. In the worst cases, they collide into a jurisdictional standoff that serves neither agency's actual purpose, which is to find the person responsible and bring them to justice. The Nancy Guthrie case, based on the public record, landed somewhere between those two poles. Not a complete operational failure. The evidence collection, the forensic processing, the behavioral analysis have all continued. But not the seamless partnership that this case, given its stakes and its profile, deserved. And the person who pays the cost of that gap is not the FBI director, is not the sheriff, is not the sergeant who went on record, is not the community leaders organizing against the investigation's leadership, is not the reporters who broke the stories of blocked access and internal dissent. The person who pays the cost is Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, missing since February 1st, dependent on a pacemaker and critical medication. Somewhere out there, in Arizona or Mexico or somewhere else entirely, alive or not, while the institutions responsible for finding her have been spending energy on a public battle that belongs in a conference room, not in the headlines. And yet here's the thing. Here is the part of this story that the institutional conflict narrative can obscure if you're not careful. The investigation is still active. The sheriff says it is getting closer. The FBI is still involved. The DNA is still being processed. The genealogical investigation, if it is underway, is still running. The reward is still out there. The tips are still being processed. The institutional conflict did not kill the investigation. It complicated it. It damaged it in ways that may never be fully measurable. It created gaps in the evidence chain that may or may not matter when the case eventually reaches a courtroom. But it did not stop it. And that distinction matters because the sabotage frame, the "is this being done from the inside" question, can lead to a conclusion that the case is hopelessly broken. And the evidence does not support that conclusion. What the evidence supports is something more nuanced and more frustrating. A case that should have been further along by now, that might have been further along if the institutional relationships had been better coordinated, but that still has viable evidence, viable investigative threads, and officials on record saying a resolution is approaching. That is not a satisfying conclusion. It does not give you a villain. It does not give you a scandal with a clean through line. It gives you the messy reality of how serious crime investigations actually work in a country where law enforcement is fragmented by design, where jurisdictional authority creates inevitable friction, and where the specific combination of a celebrity connection, a national media audience, and a politically loaded institutional conflict produced a case that no longer belongs entirely to the investigators. It belongs to the public now. And the public, watching from a distance, deserves to understand that the question, "Why hasn't this been solved?" is not answered simply by pointing at a sheriff or an FBI director or a bureaucratic process. It is answered by looking at all of it together. The institutional design, the ego, the timing, the politics, the evidence, and the human cost of every hour those things were not aligned the way they needed to be. That is the honest story of the FBI versus the sheriff in the Nancy Guthrie case. Not a simple story, not a clean villain, but a real one. And somewhere in the middle of it, past the press conferences and the public accusations and the institutional battles that none of this should have been about, there is still a woman, still missing, still waiting for the system that failed her in those early hours to find its way back to what it was supposed to be doing from the beginning, finding her, bringing her home, and making sure the person who took her can never do it again. That is what this case is about. Everything else is noise. If this video gave you something that the daily headlines could not, subscribe to Guthrie Records right now. We stay in the story past the point where the news cycle gives up. We follow the evidence, the institutions, and the human truth underneath both of them. Like this video, share it, and leave a comment telling me, do you think the institutional conflict in this case cost critical investigative time? And do you believe the sheriff should still be leading this investigation or step aside? Because those are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that the people in power in this case are going to have to answer eventually. And the sooner the public keeps asking them, the sooner those answers come.